People have asked me when I first realized there was trouble in my marriage, and honestly, it's hard to pinpoint. By the end, the problems were obvious, but I should have recognized the signs much earlier. I've learned that love can deceive you, masking clear issues, especially if they are variations of old behaviors that worsen gradually. The changes happen so slowly that the short-term differences are barely noticeable, even though the long-term impact is significant. It's like an eclipse where the daylight dims gradually until you suddenly find yourself in complete darkness, unsure of how it got that way. I'd known Kathy to be moody since the day I met her, and honestly, in some ways it endeared me toward her. The periods of icy indifference were relatively uncommon, and the contrast made the times she was cheerful and full of life seem even better. My mom had been that way, and my dad seemed to be happy. So when it came time to consider marriage, I was pretty sure I'd be able to put up with it, and that overall, life would be okay. We met when we were juniors in college, working at a bookstore just off campus. I saw her as a brooding, more serious version of the girl next door, a reticent, melancholy beauty who seemed to be complicated and a little bit broken. Her dark wit appealed to my sense of humor, and the sad aura of compromised self-esteem brought out my innate desire to be a rescuer. We talked at work for weeks before we started dating, and then gradually became more serious, until one night, while I was trying to comfort her in the middle of an inexplicable crying jag, she threw her arms around me, called me her hero, and begged me to promise that I'd never abandon her. That moment supercharged my desire to be a knight in shining armor, and we became an inseparable couple, for better or for worse. 2 years after graduating college, we officially tied the knot, and for the first 4 years of our marriage, things were okay. Not perfect, not terrible, but okay. I brought flowers home and she cooked special meals. She complained I watched sports too much and I made an issue of her buying too many clothes. We had fights, we made love. We were frustrated at times and incredibly happy at others. Good times, bad times, but generally speaking, we were okay, and there was little doubt in my mind that we loved each other. I felt in my bones that it was just a matter of time before we'd go from a couple to a family, and that we could weather any storm, that we were in for the long haul. I'd been working at an insurance company as an analyst since graduation and was slowly improving my position, working hard, being reliable, putting my shoulder to the wheel in hopes of establishing a career, creating some security. Overall, I liked the work. It paid the bills. Kathy had a business degree and got a job at a large medical clinic after graduation, but found the work tedious and unfulfilling. So, a little over 8 months before everything finally came apart, she quit her administrative job and went to work for Richardson's Charities, raising money, administering funds, and helping to keep the organization, which was generally staffed by amateurs, running smoothly. Kathy liked her new job much better, and for a couple of months she was happy and upbeat, the warm and fuzzy Kathy that made our marriage workable. But gradually her mood soured. The nights became colder, the mornings joyless, and I started biding my time, waiting for the happy Kathy to reappear. Except that this time she didn't. She started working later and later at the charity, claiming that the workload had increased and that she wasn't getting the help she needed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to avoid home life. She'd begun to lose interest in some of the things she typically loved to do: going to the movies, watching TV in front of a fire, eating out, playing a board game. It became apparent to me that she was only going through the motions, and that most of the things she'd previously enjoyed had essentially become chores for her to do, unpleasant responsibilities she had to check off her list at the end of the day. On a typical good night, she'd come home and eat a quiet dinner with me, watch TV for a while, and then move to the couch and immerse herself in her laptop or iPhone, furiously typing texts and emails. On a bad night, she simply ignored me, moving about the house anxiously, with a sense of desperation, as though she was waiting for something, almost like a drug seeker wondering where the next fix was coming from. On those nights, she'd barely eat dinner at all before shutting herself away in our guest room to bang away more messages on her laptop without me around. Sex, of course, dropped way off, and would have ceased altogether if I hadn't insisted from time to time. Prior to this, we'd had a very healthy sex life, making love 3 or 4 times a week, with Kathy initiating things a fair amount of the time. Some nights were more passionate than others, complete with frenzied, desperate couplings, while other nights we indulged in slow, comfortable lovemaking. That was all gone now. The few times I was able to get her into the bed with me, she barely participated at all, essentially becoming a fleshy sex toy. As the weeks of melancholy and indifference dragged on and on, I found I was nearing the end of my rope. I now realized that this time, things might not get better, and that the light of my marriage had been growing dimmer by the day, and I knew something had to happen. Something had to change before things became completely dark. And then, one night out of the blue, something did. Only it wasn't what I'd expected or hoped for. On the evening of 4th of July, I'd gotten home early and, in hopes of doing something to make Kathy smile, decided to try something she'd enjoyed in the past, a themed dinner of sorts. In this case, a meal of corned beef, cabbage, and beer that I dyed green. She grinned with vague amusement initially and murmured a few compliments, but we settled back into having yet another silent meal together. She began her fidgety routine again, only a little more pronounced than usual. She'd pick up her fork to stir around her food and then put it back down without really eating. She kept tapping the table with her fingers nervously and, a couple of times, cleared her throat as if to speak, but never ended up saying anything. So, at the end of the meal, I expected what had become her usual behavior, with some nervous pacing around while she ignored me until she disappeared for the night. But I was pleasantly surprised when she sat beside me on the couch while I watched a movie and snuggled up. After a few moments, she nuzzled her nose into my neck and started kissing me and then, hesitantly, whispered a breathy invitation to join her in the bedroom. I turned the TV off immediately. When we got into the bedroom, she suddenly seemed shy and anxious again. We lay on the bed together and kissed, but I felt like things from her were forced, like she was kissing me out of duty rather than desire. I tried putting some passion into the kisses, but she responded by pushing me away, standing up and removing her clothes in a nearly clinical way, as if she was simply trying to change clothes quickly, rather than preparing for sex. As soon as she was naked, she got on the bed again and, without saying a thing, pulled my face roughly into hers while mashing her lips against mine hard enough I thought we might bruise each other. But the kisses still seemed automated, and for all of the energy she was expending, the passion seemed false, like she was doing what was expected, what she was programmed to do. I tried to change the tone, to introduce some tenderness and romance, but she would have none of it and responded by literally pulling my shirt off and attacking my belt, fly, and zipper to get my pants off as quickly as possible. I again tried to slow things down a little and asked, in a light-hearted way, what the rush was. She responded abruptly, with a little anger in her voice. "What the hell, Tom? Do you want to have sex or not? Because you sure can't do it with your pants on." I laughed sheepishly to try and keep the mood light, raised my hands in a gesture to indicate I was on board with her, and started pulling my clothes off while she sat and watched impatiently on the bed. I was just getting my pants off, one foot still off the ground, when she lunged toward me. "Want to have sex now?" "Absolutely." She smiled and crawled onto the bed, and I moved toward her, but she held her hand up to stop me. "Stop there. Just hold on. We're doing something different tonight." She reached under the pillow and pulled out a tube of lube and teasingly waved it at me, smiling coldly while she raised her eyebrows expectantly. "What?" I asked, hoping I wouldn't have to guess what she wanted to do. "Just stand and watch, Tom. I know what you want." She lay there seducingly, but deep down, something about the display was disquieting. Kathy and I, over the years, had experimented with various positions and sexual techniques, but we'd never tried, or really even considered, what was on display. So, now, a warning voice was sounding in my head, telling me something was off. For weeks, really months, our sex life had deteriorated and Kathy had become increasingly cold and distant, and now, suddenly out of nowhere, she was aggressively offering something that she'd previously told me was frankly demeaning and inappropriate. It occurred to me that this was some sort of a challenge, a test by Kathy to see if I thought enough of her as a person to respect her wishes and turn down an almost irresistible sexual invitation in deference to my love and affection for her. I swallowed hard and began to choke out a few words. Kathy, we don't have to do this. I know how you, feel about this sort of thing, and I can tell you that I'm more than happy with the way we normally make love. You don't have to." Kathy took her hand off her, but stayed on her knees, looking back to me with an expression of annoyance and incredulity. She interrupted my stammering sharply. "What the hell, Tom? Does it look like I don't want this or something? Come on, Kathy. I know how you feel about, I don't want to disrespect you or anything. I want you to know that we don't have to do this sort of thing too." Her face expression turned darker, her face turning an angry red while she very nearly screamed at me. "Are you kidding me, Tom? What the hell kind of a pansy man are you anyway? Most men would kill for an invitation like this." "Kathy, it's just that. Cut the sensitivity shit, Tom. In fact, just shut the hell up altogether and have sex with me." An epic fight between my rapidly developing desire to give Kathy's request a try and the nagging idea that this was some sort of a test was waging inside my head, and I took a couple of hesitant steps toward Kathy before pausing. This progress was apparently still too slow for Kathy, and she began screaming at me again. "What the hell is the problem, Tom? Do you need some sort of a written invitation? Here, let me spell it out for you. She rose up slightly and moved her right hand back behind her again, pointing aggressively. Get the hell over here and do it. Is that clear enough? I want you to have sex with me now. With that last angry outburst, any residual reluctance to move forward vanished, drowned by her rather aggressive insults and my still acute sexual drive. I took the last few steps to her and did her. It was wild and animalistic. After a while, I realized she was crying and I pulled gently on her shoulder to try and force her to look at me, but she firmly resisted. Finally, I raised my voice a little in an attempt to get through to her. Look, Kathy, I'm sorry if I was a little rough, and I'm sorry for whatever the hell I've done to make you so mad at me, but we have to talk if we are going to survive. You have to communicate with me. She snorted in reply, paused a minute, and, in a bitter, somewhat sarcastic tone, answered, Look, Tom, I'm sure you could use some cleaning at this point. Why don't you go shower yourself down and leave me alone? I felt totally exhausted emotionally and couldn't muster the energy to further attempt to get through to her. I considered responding sarcastically to throw out another challenge, but I just sighed, slid off the bed, and took a long, hot shower. When I was done, I cracked the door to the bedroom and saw Kathy, still naked, still laying on her side, staring off into space. She was no longer crying, but her eyes were red-rimmed. I tried to talk to her one more time, but thought back on the strange sex we'd had, the contempt and anger she held for me, and the complete failures I'd experienced trying to get her to respond to me, and decided not to. Quietly, I closed the door and wondered grimly about our future together. As it turns out, this was the last time we had sex. I wasn't even vaguely surprised that the strange, hyperkinetic sexual episode represented another downturn in the ever-worsening emotional ice bath that had become my marriage. Something had to change. I broached the subject of couples counseling, of the possibility that she might need to adjust her antidepressants, that maybe we should take a long vacation together, or even apart, but all my suggestions were met with non-committal grunts or exasperated eye rolls. I found myself beginning to consider the thing that had previously been unthinkable, looking over the internet for advice on how to end a marriage, perusing the phone book for lawyers, looking for apartments closer to my work. But somehow I just couldn't quite pull the trigger. I've always been an obstinate guy, and when there was something that I wanted, I'd always been more than willing to go to some pretty extreme lengths to get it. My marriage was important to me, and I just didn't feel right about throwing in the towel just yet. I wanted to keep trying until the bitter end, until I was certain there was nothing salvageable. I was diligently looking for any opportunity to move back on the right track, to make any sort of emotional progress with my wife. So, when an invitation to go to a party with Kathy came up, I jumped at the chance. Kathy first told me about the invitation over dinner one night, a week or so before the event itself, interrupting another uncomfortably quiet meal with a reluctant, halting, half-whispered explanation of the party. She described it as the sort of thing I hated, a big shindig with stuffy conversation, fancy cocktails, and suits and evening gowns filled with highbrow people from the charity that I didn't know and likely wouldn't be interested in. But she went on to say that I was expected to attend and that she'd be humiliated if I passed on the invitation. Between her rather frank and discouraging description of the event and her subsequent insistence that I attend, it was hard to tell if she wanted me to go or not. But, as unappealing as the invitation seemed to be on the surface, it represented a faint light of hope in the gloom that had become my marriage, and I welcomed it, quickly agreeing to attend with her. Her reaction was tough to read. Superficially, she seemed to be happy that I'd agreed to go, proclaiming how much better it would be to have me there with her. But the expression on her face was oddly discordant with what she was saying, a tension backing the smile in a way that gave a sense of frustration and maybe a little anger. I felt like I was getting the classic mixed signal, and that I was being set up for failure. If I didn't go, there'd be resentment for not supporting her, more anger, more silence. If I did, I risked committing some unintentional embarrassment that would linger on as a point of contention, another thorn in the side of our already shaky relationship. But I knew our marriage was on life support, and in desperation I thought that I needed to push hard for any kind of positive time together. So as her descriptions of the party became increasingly bleak, I did my best to seem more and more interested. I started bringing up the party myself, throwing out questions that would demonstrate my interest, asking what I should wear and who would be there and what I should know or talk about when I mixed in. I even bought a new sport coat for the occasion and surprised Kathy with a new necklace and a bottle of her favorite perfume. The party was on a Friday night, and I made it home early from work to get ready. Another surprise for Kathy, since I had a bad habit of being chronically late for social events. When I got home, I found her sitting on the edge of our bed, Her favorite black dress hiked up to her hips while she pulled on her pantyhose. She was wearing the necklace and the perfume. Her hair had been professionally styled and her makeup was exquisite. She looked absolutely gorgeous, and I gave out a low wolf whistle and told her she'd be the centerpiece of the party. She gave me a neutral little smile and pulled her pantyhose the rest of the way up before replying, "Thanks, Tom." She hesitated and her expression changed to something more thoughtful. Her brow wrinkled as she bit her lip for a moment before continuing on. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe we should take both cars tonight, just in case you want to leave early." I felt a surge of annoyance that Kathy still seemed to be trying to get me to cancel. I'm sure my voice took on a petulant tone. "Look, honey, do you not want me to go to this thing? I mean, you keep harping on what a shitty time you think I'll have, and now you're suggesting that maybe I should leave early. Are you embarrassed of me, or is there something about this party that—" She abruptly waved both hands at me dismissively and interrupted. "Oh, come on, Tom. You've always hated things like this, and I was just trying to give you an easy out. If you want to go, then fine. I just don't want to hear a lot of complaining or have to leave early, that's all." The drive to the party was uncomfortably quiet. We talked a little at first, Kathy telling me about the mansion the Richardsons lived in and reminding me of some of the charities they controlled and some of the people that might be there. But there was the usual tension between us that kept any real conversation from starting, and after a few minutes we just stopped talking altogether and listened to the radio while I drove, and Kathy looked out the window absent-mindedly. The Richardsons' mansion was on the outskirts of town in an area so exclusive that you couldn't really see your neighbors. The driveway must have been a quarter-mile long, and when we got to the entry area there was a valet who parked the car while we went inside. Kathy had been there once or twice before and started showing me around and introducing me to some of the people from the charity. The mansion was predictably opulent with floors of marble and darkly stained wood, windows framed by elegant silk draperies and furniture of mahogany and soft brown leather. And there was art everywhere. Colorful, impressionistic paintings on nearly every wall, marble and granite statuary of different styles and sizes stood watch in most of the corners, and all the table surfaces were covered with elegant glass vases. In some ways it felt more like a museum than a home. I did my best to make a good impression and talked as amiably as possible with everyone I was introduced to. For the most part, the folks from the charity seemed like solid, honest people who were as out of their element in a setting like this as I was. The executives from Richardson's Industries were a different story, though. They were dressed more formally, the men mostly in tuxedos and the women wrapped in incredibly expensive-looking dresses, and they talked and conducted themselves with an ease and confidence that made it clear that their position as the people who called the shots was unassailable. After a while, Kathy drifted away to hobnob with some of the Richardson people, and I found myself discussing the finer points of beer appreciation with a couple of the lower-level pencil pushers. One of the guys mentioned that he'd seen a basketball game playing on an enormous TV in some sort of entertainment room, and we all slipped away to watch the fourth quarter. When the game was over, an hour or so later, I made my way back to the main party. I spotted Kathy in a group with 3 or 4 couples, Richardson people holding their drinks, nodding and talking, no doubt, about their latest European vacation. The women seemed to be the drivers of the conversation, and the men all seemed to be preoccupied with Kathy. Not that I could blame them. The black dress perfectly showed off her slim figure and long, graceful legs, and, in this lighting, her olive skin and dark hair gave her an exotic, Mediterranean look that, for me at least, was irresistibly attractive. I started to make my way toward them through the crowd when I noticed a distinguished-looking man, maybe 45 years old or so, in a brilliant white tuxedo with oiled hair and a deep tan, move confidently into the group. All conversation stopped in deference to his presence, and as he began to talk, everyone looked to him attentively. I felt I'd seen or met him before, and after a few moments I came to recognize that this was Craig Richardson himself. Deciding that I'd rather not get tied down in a conversation with the captains of industry, I simply took a seat at a bar on the edge of the room and watched the group, waiting for it to split up a little before I approached my wife again. Kathy, like everyone else in the group, had her eyes glued, admiringly, on Mr. Richardson, and I could see that he, like the rest of the men in the group, was more than a little interested in Kathy. It wasn't long before he was talking mostly to her, occasionally reaching out to touch her on the shoulder or the arm, constantly flashing her wolfish grin and leaning in close to her replies. After a while, a band started to play music, and when some of the couples started to dance, he paired off with her for a few numbers. Well, I didn't really like Kathy dancing with other guys, at least not without my permission, but I didn't want to make a scene, especially with her boss. So I sat at the bar stool, waiting for an opportunity to jump in, quietly fuming while I nursed a drink I'd absent-mindedly ordered. I guess I was staring at them pretty hard, undoubtedly with a somewhat menacing look. when one of the most attractive women I've ever met settled into the seat next to me. She was in her early 30s with thick, strawberry blonde hair, pale, nearly translucent, marble-smooth skin and a soft, voluptuous body that seemed to wiggle in all the right places when she moved. She gave me a tentative smile and nodded to the dance floor and my wife. "Your wife is beautiful." I wasn't, at first, certain she was talking to me or that she was referring to Kathy, and I couldn't quite clear my head to reply quickly. "Huh." I eventually answered dumbly. "Your wife," she said, nodding again to the dance floor. "She's beautiful. I can hardly blame my husband wanting to dance with her. I hope it doesn't bother you too much." She gave me a warm, knowing smile that was somehow a little sad also, coming to the belated realization that the gorgeous woman talking to me was Craig Richardson's wife. I felt my face flush and began to stammer out an embarrassed reply. "Oh, it's, okay. I just don't mind, really. I'm just, watching them dance her for a while. I'm not really a great dancer, so She tittered at my discomfort, a beautiful, clear little laugh that completely disarmed me. "It's okay. Tom, isn't it?" "Yes. How did you know?" "Oh, Kathy and I work together at the charity quite a bit. Naturally, she's mentioned you. And I saw you both come in together earlier this evening." She smiled at me again and cocked her head expectantly, but still a little tongue-tied. I didn't answer, my mouth opening and closing without making a sound. "Well, anyway," she said, extending a delicate hand. "My name is Danielle Richardson. It's good to meet you, Tom." I took her hand and shook it and finally found my voice. "It's good to meet you too. You have a fabulous home." She smiled with pleasure at the compliment, and we talked for a while about the house and the art and her responsibilities at the charity. She recognized I felt a little uncomfortable at a party like this and suggested I could play some pool in the billiard room later on to kill time. Finally, the dance floor emptied as the band stopped playing and Danielle nodded toward my wife. "Looks like she's free now, and I guess you'll want to get back with her, and I've got to mingle with the other guests. It's been great talking with you." I nodded, told her I'd enjoyed our conversation, and started to make my way to Kathy, picking my way carefully through the guests, the waiters, and the statues. When I got to Kathy, I put my arm around her and gave her a little squeeze. She asked where I'd been, and I told her I'd met a few people, including Danielle, and that I'd watched part of a basketball game. I could tell she'd been drinking some, and she slurred out a sarcastic remark about the party being the ideal place to take in a sporting event. It was clear that she was a little annoyed with me, but I ignored that and made a valiant attempt to make conversation with her and her Richardson pals. After a while, though, it was pretty clear I was a fifth wheel, and I whispered to Kathy that I was going to look around some more. She nodded her head to me and I wandered off. I ended up in the billiard room with some of the guys I'd met earlier in the evening. We pretty much turned the room into the kind of party we liked, rolling up our sleeves, munching on pretzels and drinking beer, all while watching ESPN and shooting pool. I'd been there for a little over an hour when Danielle Richardson entered the room tentatively and motioned to me, calling my name quietly. I made my way to her, and she bent close to whisper into my ear. Tom, maybe you should go get Kathy. She's had a lot to drink, and maybe you should consider taking her home now." We were both embarrassed at her having to tell me this, and I nodded in reply and simply said, "Okay," letting her lead the way back to the main party where Danielle pointed to a raucous group of people sitting on a pair of couches. I spotted Kathy, sitting on Craig Richardson's lap as though she belonged there, her arm around his neck, laughing loudly and drunkenly at a joke someone had just told. Her hair was a mess, and her dress appeared a little disheveled. I swore quietly to myself and turned toward Danielle, trying my best to choke out an apology, but she waved it off, attributing all the bad behavior to too much drink. "Honestly, if you just get her home and to bed, it will all be good," she said, smiling as I started to make my way to the couches. I touched Kathy on the shoulder to get her attention and quietly told her it was time to go, but she made it clear, in a loud, slurred retort, that she wasn't particularly interested in leaving. I stayed firm and insisted and started to think there'd be a scene until Craig Richardson himself, who seemed a little embarrassed by the situation, encouraged her to get going. Reluctantly, she stood up, wavering considerably, and awkwardly smoothed her dress and gathered her purse before I led her out to the car in silence, supporting her as we walked to minimize her drunken stagger. Once in the car, she started in on me, loudly accusing me of ruining things for her by leaving early, aggressively reminding me that this was why she wanted to take 2 cars. I told her there was no way she'd be able to drive home safely regardless of how many cars we took, and went on a rant criticizing her drunken antics and overly familiar behavior with Craig Richardson. The argument continued back and forth until we got home, when Kathy got out of the car before I even pulled into the garage, slammed the car door, and stomped her way to the front entryway. After parking the car and getting a quick drink of water in the kitchen, I went to our room and found her already in bed, fully clothed. Her arms crossed over her chest while she fumed, conspicuously looking away from me when I entered the room. I tried to start a conversation to get some sort of détente going, but she turned away from me and refused to speak, leaving a cold, silent gap between us. I slept on the couch that night. The cold, silent gap between us ended abruptly the next morning when Kathy woke me up with a pitcher of ice water to the face, followed by a profanity-laced diatribe delivered at breakneck speed detailing how thoroughly disgusted she was with my behavior. After wiping my face dry, I matched her volume with suggestions that the ice water was the warmest thing she'd done for me in weeks, and that if she liked her friends at the charity so much better, she ought to just hang out with them. She smirked, bent over, and picked up a suitcase, showing it off like it was the answer to my last challenge, turned around sharply and left the living room, the middle finger of her left hand extended upward over her shoulder. She slammed the door, and a few seconds later I heard the sound of her car leave the driveway. So, there I was, left alone at home by my wife, the woman I had loved and the woman who I had come to hate, wondering just how far a man should go before he calls it quits on a marriage. I wasn't sure of the answer, exactly, but I was confident that I was pretty far past the line of reasonable effort. If this had happened in years past, I would have been on pins and needles, waiting for a text or a phone call from her, aching for a chance to exchange apologies and make things right. I would have been frantic trying to figure out where she'd gone, worrying if she was safe, hoping she'd return as soon as possible. But honestly, I just didn't have the energy or the inclination to care anymore. I simply went on living, going to work, watching TV, reading books, but now with the added activity of making phone calls to lawyers. 5 days later, I was taking a break from work, sitting in a family law office, waiting impatiently for an appointment with a paralegal, when I received 2 emails from Kathy. The first was a cold, terse command, without any kind of a salutation. It read simply, "I'm back. We need to talk. Meet me tonight at home after work." I snorted when I read it, thinking of the hubris of insisting that we meet to work out our problems after she had so thoroughly rejected any opening I'd quite literally begged for in the weeks preceding our epic falling out. The second email, though, was clearly sent to me as a mistake on her part, probably accidentally copying my address after sending the first email. It was a far warmer, more affectionate message that was intended for someone else, someone by the name of Chicago Man. The note alluded to a recent outing they'd had, an evening at a high-end restaurant, and the theater followed by a relatively torrid sexual encounter. She signed it Love, Kathy. I felt 2 emotions reading the second email. The first was embarrassment. Embarrassment at my own dedication to a woman and a marriage that wasn't, evidently, worth the effort. Embarrassment at my own naivete, and, really, my own stupidity at having failed to accurately see the true picture of my relationship with Kathy. A picture that, somehow, I'd been unable or perhaps simply unwilling to face at any time during the gut-wrenching unraveling of our relationship. A picture of an unfaithful wife who'd given up on her commitment in order to be with someone else. The other emotion I felt was pure, white-hot, unmitigated anger. I was very nearly choking with it, my teeth clenched so hard that I could barely breathe, my head pounding with thoughts of mayhem. When I'd read the first note demanding a meeting, I thought that I would simply blow her off and proceed with a divorce, serving her first and then talking through a postmortem of our marriage later. But now that I understood the true nature of our problems, the true nature of her betrayal, I wanted to talk, wanted confrontation, wanted her to own up to her infidelity and explain why, exactly, she thought it was okay to stab me in the back. I doubt that I made much sense to the paralegal as I robotically filled out paperwork and answered questions. My mind was so preoccupied with the realization of Kathy's infidelity and my anxiousness to confront her about it that I didn't pay any real attention to what she was saying and just signed my name where she pointed and answered questions in the most superficial way possible. I called back to work, told them I had a family emergency, and went directly home after my time with the paralegal, itching for a fight. But instead of Kathy, I found a note pinned to the door explaining that she'd been called back to the charity and our talk would have to be postponed. I was so keyed up that I screamed in frustration, threw open the door and stomped into the kitchen, rubbing my head with both hands, mumbling to myself as I paced back and forth from the kitchen to the living room. But I stopped in my tracks when I saw that Kathy had left her laptop, open and running, on the dining room table. I knew that laptop had the information that would confirm my suspicious and satisfy unanswered questions. I wanted those answers and I wanted that information, not just to satisfy my curiosity, but to provide tools that I might use to exact some sort of revenge, Not just on my wife, but on the high and mighty philanthropic captain of industry I was sure she was cheating with. Without any hesitation, I scooped the computer up, jumped in my car, and headed to the one guy I thought could help, an old frat buddy by the name of Ted Moore. Ted was someone who wouldn't stand out in crowd. He was an unassuming guy with an average build and an average face with average brown hair, and who wore average clothes. He was, in fact, average in nearly every way except that, like a true nerd, he had an uncanny ability to hack into computers. Now, everyone knows someone like this. A guy who somehow intuitively understands computers the way most people understand their friends, who know how to get even the most obstinate computer to give up its secrets. In college, he honed his skill and sharpened his inclination to break into nearly any system at school, at work, or on anybody's personal computer. And he did it routinely, to gather information, to get the answers to tests, to pull off elaborate practical jokes, or just for the hell of it. His skill eventually turned out well for him, and he landed a job in IT security with a local bank, but I knew he still hacked around on the side, just for fun. So, I was pretty sure that Ted would be able to get anything incriminating that Kathy left on her computer. I called him as I was driving, and he sounded like he'd just gotten up from a nap or something and was a little surprised to hear from me. But when I told him I needed some help and implied it had to do with breaking into a computer, he perked up considerably and invited me over. Ted lived alone, in an apartment that looked a little like a laundry dump for dirty clothes onto which the garbage from multiple fast food meals and some beer bottles had been scattered. Really, just the classic bachelor housekeeping stereotype. He had me sit at the kitchen table and offered me a beer, which I declined. He got one himself, though, and plopped into the chair across from me, took a swig, and asked what the problem was. I described, vaguely at first, and then with progressively more detail, what was happening in my marriage and what I was suspicious of. Ted listened attentively, nodding or grimacing at the right times, making it clear that he sympathized with my plight. When I finished, he pursed his lips and thought for a second before pointing to the laptop and speaking. "So, I take it you want me to break into her laptop and see what the shitty details are, is that it?" I nodded. "Yeah, pretty much that's it. And if I find some really nasty stuff, what then? I mean, it sounds like you and Kathy are through either way. What's the point of digging into this stuff if it won't change the endgame?" I shrugged my shoulders. "I guess I just want to know what exactly she's up to, and I don't think she'll ever give me the straight story. Plus, if she's screwing the guy I think she is, then I might be able to use the information to make this a little painful for the a-hole." Ted nodded in understanding. "Okay, fair enough," he said, spinning the laptop around and opening it up with a single smooth move of his right hand. "This will probably take a while, so you might want to make yourself comfortable." I grunted in agreement and started making my way to his clothes-covered couch, thinking to watch some TV or take a nap, but Ted held me up with one more question. "Hey, just for grins, you don't happen to know any of Kathy's passwords or anything, do you?" Well, she used SkinnyGirl97 in the past, but I really don't think. What happened when you tried to get into her email with that?" he asked, tapping away at the keyboard. "I didn't try. I mean, I figured I wouldn't be able to find anything myself." "Yeah, well, it might have saved you a trip over here," he said as he pivoted the laptop toward me. "Take a look." I moved back to the table and saw that he'd opened her email account. I'm sure she's deleted all of the incriminating stuff. I wasn't particularly confident of my words, suddenly feeling more than a little foolish as I moved back to the kitchen table. "Yeah, well, take a closer look. There are a whole bunch of undeleted emails between her and this Chicago man dude." I sat down at the table and looked again at the computer, seeing that Kathy's inbox was open, displaying maybe 30 or so email threads, at least 20 of which were messages to and from Chicago man. I shrugged my shoulders sheepishly and shook my head to indicate my surprise and embarrassment that they had been there for me to read all along, and then took a deep breath, pulled the computer closer, and began to read. It was clear, from the first message, that Chicago man was, in fact, Craig Richardson, and that the affair had been going on for at least 3 or 4 months, mostly consummated during daytime hours when she was supposed to be working at the charity. The messages themselves consisted of anything from a quick note of thanks or an invitation for another afternoon together to tremendously explicit recapitulations of their most recent tryst. I was, on occasion, mentioned in the emails, but only in passing, essentially a subject to be avoided while they planned for their next get-together. Danielle Richardson was hardly mentioned at all. By the time I'd finished reading, the anger that had dissipated somewhat over the last few hours was back. I'd bit my lower lip bloody, and I felt myself opening and closing my fists, spasmodically, hot acid rising in my throat. The recollection of her drunkenly sitting in Richardson's lap, Thinking that she was making him uncomfortable when they were simply flaunting their affair in my face was particularly galling. That and her general recent behavior toward me, the fact that she had so casually given herself to him and treated me and our relationship like inconsequential lint, completed my outrage, and I felt any residual inclination to allow for a quiet, uncomplicated closure of our relationship melt away. I wasn't sure what I'd do, but I knew I wanted both Richardson and my wife to feel my heat, and I wanted them to feel it in the most uncomfortable way possible. Ted gave me a half smile and spoke like he was reading my mind. You know, Tom, thinking back on some of the retribution you've rained down on people that have crossed you, I'd have to say that you're probably not going to take this lying down. Am I right? I flared my nostrils and nodded my head. Well, I don't know what exactly you're going to do, but if it ends up being something fun, count me in, okay? I gave a bitter little smile back. Okay, Verg, okay. I sat there for a few minutes more, staring at nothing, tapping my fingers while I fumed and thought, recognizing that waiting for some sort of malevolent inspiration in how to exact my revenge wasn't presently coming to me. I got up and reached for the laptop. You going now? Yep. You know what you're going to do? Not yet. Hey, then, mind if I keep the laptop to poke around some more? Maybe I'll find something usable. I briefly thought about how mad Kathy might be if she knew I'd absconded with her computer, but then I realized I didn't really care. Yeah, please keep it. Look for pictures, videos, anything that I can embarrass that prick Richardson. Ted smiled and nodded. Kathy was waiting for me when I got home, evidently off work from the charity earlier than she expected. I found her in the living room and, not surprisingly, she was steaming about her missing laptop, hands on her hips, her face already slightly crimson with anger. She addressed me with a sort of snarl, her voice a tight, shrill whistle. Where the hell is my computer? I ignored the question, walked by her as casually as possible, flopped down onto the couch and put my feet up on the coffee table, a habit that I know annoyed Kathy to no end. I made no attempt to look back at Kathy, but could hear a strain of incredulousness enter her voice as she entered the room after me. Tom, did you hear me? Where is my computer? On the drive home, I'd thought about playing my cards close to my vest and not let on that I knew about her affair before I had a plan in place to get even, but I knew I didn't have the discipline or patience to pull off some sort of an elaborate surprise that required days, or even weeks, of subterfuge. So, now, faced with another of Kathy's hostile outbursts, I decided to go for immediate confrontation and save revenge for later. I elected to open my attack with brutal, unvarnished honesty, partly for the shock value and partly because I was in the mood for a fight and I knew this would get one going. I flicked the TV on and without looking at her, answered as neutrally as possible, taking great care to clear all the emotion from my voice. I took your computer to Ted's as a matter of fact. He's snooping around right now, turning up all the dirt he can on your cheating butt. She didn't say anything, and I couldn't resist glancing back to observe her reaction. Her teeth were clenched, her eyebrows raised, and her face had now turned beet red. I guess I'd hoped for a little surprise and maybe some sort of contrition, some kind of an apology, but instead I was getting pure, unadulterated anger. After taking several deep breaths that I could actually hear her drawing through flared nostrils, Kathy began to spit venom back at me, her voice loud and dripping with contempt. My cheating butt? Really? Is that what your excuse is? She began, taking several aggressive steps toward me. You think that you have a right to go through all my personal stuff just because you imagine I'm with another man? You're delusional. I abruptly raised my hand to stop her, more than matching the decibel level of her voice with mine. Save it, Kathy. Just save it. I know about it all. The signs were all there, the bitchiness, the ice princess treatment, the lame excuses. You're cheating and we both know it. So spare me the denials. Ted has just been getting the nasty little details for me, that's all. She stood there for a moment, her hands opening and closing into tight fists, her face a contorted mixture of anger and frustration, breathing so heavily and hotly, I half expected her to spit fire. I maintained my silence, trying to look as smug and unconcerned as possible, afraid, really, to let on that I was feeling any pain at all. Finally, she abruptly pivoted and started toward our bedroom, stomping away with enough force that I could feel the vibrations through the floor. Halfway down the hall, she turned and shouted over her shoulder, I don't have to listen to this ridiculous crap. Well, then, by all means don't. Just get the hell out of here. I answered back as nonchalantly as possible. For 15 or 20 minutes, she noisily opened closets and drawers, pulled down a bag from an upper shelf, and cleaned out her stuff from the bathroom to supplement the things she'd already taken the week before. When she was done, she came back down the hallway, pulling a suitcase with squeaky wheels behind her. She stopped in the living room and took a couple of deep breaths while I gave her a look that I hoped reflected unconcern and maybe a little bit of boredom. "Sorry, Tom. I thought we could maybe talk about our issues, but your attitude sucks. I need my laptop for work, so I expect it back within 24 hours. Just put it on the dining room table. I'm going to stay with some friends. Don't try and follow me." Her voice was measured but melodramatic, and she spit out the last few words resentfully as she turned toward the front door to leave. I decided to fire one last shot. "Well, be sure to tell Craig Richardson thanks for putting you up. I'm sure you'll be saving a lot of money rooming with him in his big house." That little declaration halted her in her tracks, and she slowly turned around and gave me a narrow-eyed look of suspicious contempt. "What do you mean by that?" "Wait," I laughed. "You can't possibly think I haven't figured out that you've been screwing Craig Richardson? Come on, Kathy, you haven't exactly been discreet, and I'm not nearly as clueless as you seem to think I am. So that's your game? You plan to screw up Craig Richardson because of your suspicions? Something like that?" Her tone stayed contemptuous. "I don't know. Maybe I'll do nothing. Maybe I'll show up and make some problems. Maybe I'll rain holy hell down on all of you. Right now, I'm just wondering how his wife or his charities and businesses would view a messy divorce involving Craig Richardson's name linked to a lot of salacious behavior with a married woman." Her look of contempt deepened, and her tone took on an element of disgusted anger. "You wouldn't dare try anything like that. You don't have the balls to confront a man like Richardson. You'll just cower here on the couch and, as soon as I'm gone, cry yourself to sleep. God, you really are pitiful. Craig is a real man, Tom. An accomplished man. Not some little boy who flails away at life, trying to make his mark in a world that finds him totally and utterly irrelevant. You wouldn't be able to hurt him or his life any more than a little bug can make a difference in yours. Good luck trying." She'd spit out the last words, one by one, emphasizing the disrespect she developed for me. Too could feel my heart begin to pound as she screamed on, struggling to keep from overreacting, from exploding out of my chair and slapping her like the bitch she was being. In the end, I managed to simply smile at her blandly and, in a gesture mirroring the one she'd given me a week before, showed her the middle finger of my right hand as she turned to leave. After I heard the front door slam, I sat on the edge of the couch, rocking back and forth with a growing sense of unmitigated outrage while I thought about our latest, most important, and probably final fight as a married couple. In addition to the anger, I couldn't help a faint feeling of disappointment and surprise. Kathy was nothing if not proud, and so I didn't expect her to grovel and beg for forgiveness, but I did think she might be at least a little embarrassed if not apologetic. But even more puzzling were her final comments as she left, essentially taunting me with the idea that I'd resign myself to play a passive role in the demise of our marriage, and that I wasn't man enough to stand up to a guy like Craig Richardson. Although I wouldn't consider myself an out-of-control hothead, I had a long history of accepting and maybe even relishing confrontation, a trait I'd inherited from my father, who encouraged me to make sure anyone who crossed me understood their mistake. In fact, at times, my over-the-top reactions to a variety of relatively minor insults, from inconsiderate slights and improprieties, had been an occasional bone of contention between Kathy and me. Anyone that knew me, maybe especially Kathy, knew that I was a guy who was more than happy to wade into conflict. I couldn't decide if this was just the only insult she could wave at me in a pinch, or she just wasn't thinking at all. She had to know that I wasn't a shrinking violet, and that a challenge like that would only pique my interest in a clash. I began to wonder if she somehow wanted me to follow her and find her with another man, that she wanted to show me how thoroughly I'd been replaced. I stewed on this question for a good hour, trying to talk myself into being cool and letting her go. No need to do something that might land me in jail. In the end, though, my aggressive nature won out and I opted for more confrontation. I thought maybe I could put a little scare into the loving couple, or maybe, if I got lucky, get some pictures or other information that might supplement whatever Ted could find. Something that would make them both squirm a little. I pulled into Craig Richardson's immense driveway about an hour later, looked around for Kathy's car, and spotted it parked in a guest space by the garage. I thought about sneaking about, maybe going around to the back of the house and looking through a few windows first, but opted for the direct approach, marched up the driveway and knocked loudly and obnoxiously long on the massive front door. I guess I expected some servant to answer, but was surprised when I heard a feminine voice calling out just prior to the door opening to reveal Danielle Richardson, barefoot, wearing a sundress, her hair in thick French braids and with tear streaks running down her pale, otherwise flawless face. "Oh, Tom, What can I do for you? She sniffled and rubbed her reddened nose and eyes as she spoke. I'm looking for Kathy. Is she here? I didn't want to take my anger out on Danielle, so I tried to be neutral, but I know my tone was sharp, even a little pushy. Danielle shook her head. No, she's not here. Her face clouded over, and then she abruptly burst into tears. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm trying to keep things under control, but it's just so. I stepped toward her, put my hand on her shoulder, and, as gently as possible, asked what exactly was going on. Oh, I think you know. I think you know that Kathy and Craig are having an affair? She nodded, evidently unable to speak for a moment, as it occurred to me that Kathy's affair was coldly ruining 2 marriages, causing heartache not just for me, but also for Danielle. My anger peaked again, and I became hardened to the idea that she and Craig should pay some sort of a price for the way they'd betrayed their spouses. Danielle had been looking at the ground and sniffling, sobbing gently to herself, but when she finally looked up, I caught her eye and asked, more forcefully than I intended, "Where are they?" She grimaced and covered her mouth and trembling chin for a moment, and then began to choke out an answer. "I'm pretty sure they've gone to Green Valley Hill. She got here an hour ago, and they both left in his car." Green Valley Hill? It's a getaway for us, sort of a lakeside retreat. How do I find it? Is Green Valley Hill all I need to know? Danielle shook her head slowly. I don't know, Tom. Maybe you'd better not go there. You seem pretty angry, and you don't want to. I'm not going to be violent, Danielle. I just want to give them a piece of my mind. That's all. The truth is, I wasn't sure if I'd be violent or not, and I definitely wanted more than to give a piece of my mind. I wanted pictures and video and anything at all that could embarrass Kathy and Craig. I wanted some sort of revenge, and I wanted it as soon as possible. I spread my hands in a conciliatory, pleading gesture and waited for her to respond. She sniffled a few more times and then looked me in the eye. It's an hour or so north of here. She stretched her hand out, palm up towards me. Let me see your cell phone. I'll put it in your GPS. 45 minutes later, I was carefully driving my car up a private 1-lane road, flanked on either side by thick stands of oaks and maples. The sun was just setting, and in the gloaming, I could barely make out the lights of what appeared to be a ridiculously oversized log cabin half a mile or so away. I made a snap decision to preserve the element of surprise, so I pulled my car off the road and began making my way toward the cottage through the trees. The forest opened up on a broad lawn centered in front of the cottage, and I paused when movement near a low security wall 30 or so feet in front of the house caught my eye. In the dim light, I could barely make out the form of a large man crouching behind the wall, evidently trying not to be seen from the driveway. I could only assume that he was some sort of a security detail that had been alerted by my approaching car and was waiting to detain me. Staying in the woods, I circled around the lawn toward the lake shore at the back of the house and then, as quickly and quietly as possible, made my way to a porch overlooking the lake, mounted the steps, and quietly opened an unlocked screen door. I found myself in what appeared to be a giant living room that was styled in a sort of rustic opulence that only a man of Craig Richardson's means could achieve. The floors were burnished red oak partially covered in thick, luxurious rugs and furs. The furniture was all rich, soft leather, and the walls were covered with Western art, hunting trophies, and shelves that contained small, wooden carvings. A huge stone fireplace, unlit, dominated the hall, and a pair of stairways ran up either side of the room, giving access to an overlooking, railed walkway off of which projected perhaps a dozen or so doors. I stood there for a moment unsure what to do or where to go next until I heard something coming from somewhere above me. Holding my breath, I just made out the faint sound of a voice or voices coming from one of the rooms off the upstairs walkway. Moving quietly up the stairs, I also began to make out some background music, classical and romantic, and could smell incense drifting down the hallway. By the time I was just outside the door, it became clear that I wasn't hearing a conversation, but rather a loud, frantic, sexually charged exchange dominated by a female voice, Kathy's voice. I could now hear every word with a sickening clarity, and her pronouncements and the passion with which they were delivered made me grit my teeth until my jaw hurt and I began to see red. Do me, Craig. Use me like your little toy, baby. Oh, I love what you do to me. I love what you do to me. Driving to Green Valley Hill, I decided on a plan that involved quietly finding a way to surreptitiously record their tryst and use the video, perhaps by releasing it through the internet, to cause the shithead Richardson and my 304 of a wife as much public embarrassment as possible. But standing there outside the door, listening to my wife's unmitigated treachery as she begged the a-hole to take what was supposed to be mine, I lost any desire to be subtle or quiet or controlled. I pulled my cell phone out of a jacket pocket, set it to video, threw open the door and burst into the room. What I found was so disorienting that it took more than a few moments to understand what I was seeing. Kathy was standing in front of me, fully dressed in jeans and a pullover sweater, looking mildly surprised. I saw her put a cell phone to her ear and say something like, "He's here now." "No, he's in the room right now." While she was talking, the sounds of passionate lovemaking continued and I was able to discern that they were coming from a pair of speakers sitting on a desk immediately adjacent to a large, four-poster bed. The bed was turned down roughly with sheets in disarray, and, lying in the middle, half propped up by some pillows jammed against the headboard, was Craig Richardson. He was on top of the sheets, motionless, wearing only a pair of white boxer shorts, his face a pale gray, and an ugly wound, welling with dark purple blood, dominated the center of his chest. I moved away from the door to get a closer look at Craig, almost not believing what I was seeing. I could hardly process the surreal combination of my wife talking in a nearly businesslike manner on her cell phone, with her disembodied, sexualized voice percolating through incense-filled air, while a dead man dressed only in his underwear reclined in the center of the room on an oversized bed. I looked closer at the gray face, the lack of chest motion, the ugly, bloody wound looking for any sign of life. Any possible way that I was interpreting this wrong. But it was clear that he was unequivocally dead, the very picture of death. I looked back to my wife, who continued to talk on the phone. She looked at me without reacting, shaking her head as though she was frustrated with the way things were playing out. I looked back and forth a couple of times, literally unable to move, rubbing my hands through my hair, simultaneously struggling to make sense of what I was seeing and trying to form the will to act. I was shaken out of my frozen confusion by the sound of approaching footsteps pounding up the stairs and over the walkway. I looked to the door to see a large, pale white man with a shaved head, almost certainly the security guard I'd seen earlier in the evening, plunge into the room. He carried what looked like a .38 revolver in his gloved left hand and some sort of stun gun in his right. He looked to Kathy when he entered the room and didn't seem to see me at first, but she gestured in my direction with a nod of her head and he turned to face me, our eyes locking. He took 2 rapid steps toward me and then abruptly raised his right hand and fired the stun gun while I instinctively ducked. The probes unspooled with a whirl and embedded into a wood beam beside the bed with a loud crack. I lunged away from the bed and scrambled to the nearest window and shattered it with a small piece of statuary before launching myself through, slicing my jacket and my pants, scraping both arms and lacerating my left leg as I passed through the broken glass to land on the roof of a fortuitously situated garage. I looked back to the window and saw Shavehead appear. I knew he carried a gun and so, in desperation, I rolled off the garage before he could fire something fatal, falling to the ground with a thud and a grunt. From there I found my bearings and sprinted toward the woods and onto my car, my torn leg aching and my lungs burning as I ran faster and longer than I had in years. By the time I reached the car I was dizzy, exhausted and confused, and my shaking hands could barely turn the key into the ignition. I glanced into the rear-view mirror and saw lights coming down the drive. So I stomped on the gas and, barely in control of the car, careened through the woods until I made the main highway. I had no idea what to do, where to go, or even what exactly was going on. I drove randomly for an hour or so, skirting the smaller communities around the lake, taking care to avoid spending too much time in one area. My leg hurt badly. I had a terrible headache and I couldn't seem to think clearly. I immersed in a thick fog of confusion and my sense of panic wasn't helping me to sort things out. In retrospect, calling the police and reporting the incident seems like the obvious move, but in the moment I was unsure of anything, let alone if or how the police would react if I reported the incident. Driven by fear and by instinct, I started to make my way toward home before it occurred to me that this would be the first place Shavehead would look. I decided I needed to go somewhere safe, but someplace relatively unexpected, so I began indirectly making my way back to the one person in the area I thought I could trust. It was nearly 10 o'clock when I found myself standing outside of Ted's apartment, hesitantly reaching up to knock on his door. He answered it with an air of annoyance that abruptly turned to surprise and then concern as he noted my condition. Bloody leg, torn clothes, babbling semi-coherently about guns and cheating wives and a rich, dead man. Ted quickly pulled me inside and cleared his debris-covered couch, throwing armfuls of clothes and pizza boxes onto the floor, and ordered me to lie down, take off my pants and shut up for a few minutes. He momentarily disappeared into his bathroom and returned with a brown bottle which he uncapped and then proceeded to pour the contents over my leg wound. The pain was sudden, deep and electric, and my response was to jerk my leg away and yell at Ted, "What the hell is that?" What are you doing? Ted looked a little annoyed, shrugged his shoulders, and replied, "It's peroxide, man. The cut looks bad and I figured we'd better clean it up some. It's either this or some vodka I have in the kitchen. I thought this seemed like the better choice." I grunted in agreement but reached out and grabbed the peroxide and proceeded to drizzle it over my leg. Ted left for the kitchen and came back with a clean towel and some duct tape. I looked at him quizzically. "Bandage," he said flatly, answering my unspoken question and kneeling by my leg. He folded the towel up, pressed it against the wound, and firmly taped it to my leg. "Okay, that should hold for a while. Now, put your pants back on before I get too creeped out. I'll get you something to drink." I painfully pulled my pants back on and Ted returned from the kitchen with a couple of beers. He shoved one into my hand and fell onto the couch next to me. We sat there silently for a few minutes sipping our beers and staring at the trash on the floor until Ted finally cleared his throat and turned to me. "So, can you tell me what the hell happened to you without sounding like some sort of a coked-up auctioneer?" I smiled grimly and proceeded to describe to him, as carefully and as controlled as possible, about the strange experience I'd had that night. He listened intently, and his expression changed from interest to concern to borderline disbelief as I recounted the events at Green Valley Hill. After I was done, he shook his head as he considered the story. "You call the police?" "No. Why not? You busted in on a murder. You ought to get the police involved, for your own safety if nothing else." I just want to think about what to do for a while. I swear to God, it with the way they were waiting for me there, Kathy talking on the phone, the shaved-headed dude firing at me. It was some sort of a setup, and I don't know if the police are already after me. And I just don't get it. If she was having an affair with Craig Richardson, why have him killed and set me up? It just doesn't make sense to me. I want to understand what the hell is going on. I need information. Something to try and figure this out. Ted pursed his lips and looked at me, evidently weighing whether he should say what was on his mind. "Are you sure she was having an affair with Richardson? Positive?" I was incredulous that he'd even asked the question. "Well, shit, Ted. You saw the emails. I told you about how she was acting at the party. And she admitted it when she left. I mean, she threw it right in my face, called me names, and announced she was going to him. How much surer can I be?" Ted answered in a calm, measured tone. "Well, from where I sit, she made it pretty easy for you to think she was with Richardson, and honestly, knowing your history, the way she taunted you today was like the perfect bait to make you chase her down." I swallowed hard as I considered what he'd said and pressed my eyes closed in an effort to concentrate against a growing headache. "Shit, Ted. Maybe she's in with somebody else. Maybe that shaved-headed guy. Hell, I don't even know if I'm playing a game, let alone who I might be playing against. I mean, if you're right, then we have to find out all over again who she's screwing. Tom, let me ask you something." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand nervously while I opened my hands in a gesture to proceed. "Did you and Kathy do some, kinky stuff from time to time?" The question had come out of nowhere and I couldn't see the relevance. What's that got to do with what's going on? Humor me for a minute. Anything kinky games at all? Like what, Ted? I mean, we've tried a few things like most couples, but nothing I'd really consider kinky. Well, you know about amateur porn sites, right? Couples that like to tape themselves and post it on the net? Sure. Well, wait. No, we don't do that at all. I mean, what's this about? Ted rubbed his hands together for a minute and then, in a vaguely reluctant manner, wandered to the kitchen table, retrieved Kathy's computer, and set it on a box in front of the couch. He opened it up and pounded out a few keystrokes before turning it to me. "Here, take a look at this video while I, use the bathroom for a while. Let me know what you think when I get back." Ted shuffled out of the room without looking back and loudly shut the bathroom door behind him, signaling that I was alone. I started the video, and within moments felt a sickening lump form in my gut. I'd seen porn before, pictures, videos of all kinds, the whole gamut that most every guy in America indulges in from time to time. But I'd never seen porn that included my wife, and I'd certainly never seen myself, and I never dreamed that the night she offered me sex while we were being filmed. I watched with increasing horror as she prepared herself. I watched for a couple of minutes or less before the pain, revulsion, and embarrassment become too much and shut it down, pinching my eyes shut as if I could extirpate the vision through simple physical effort. After a while, Ted made his way back out and sat quietly on the floor by the computer. I could barely look him in the eye. Let me explain. She, oh God, this is so weird. You didn't know you were being filmed at all? Hell no. At the time, I wasn't even sure it wasn't some sort of a trap to see if I'd respect her or something. It was completely out of character for her to ask for it, and the idea that she'd arranged to have it filmed. My head was starting to hurt so badly, it felt like the pressure would push my eyes out. I closed them and pushed the heels of my hands into my sockets as hard as I could and slowly spoke to Ted through the darkness. How is this even related to the shitstorm I walked into tonight? It may not be, but listen, we're looking for someone that might be behind this whole thing. Someone that got Kathy involved, because it doesn't make sense she put this all together herself, right? I nodded to him in agreement, and he continued. So, this video. It was attached to an email thread between Kathy and some guy that kept asking if she'd gotten it done, like he was daring her or forcing her to do it, and the video was like some sort of proof that she'd gone through with it. I have to wonder if he was, I don't know, maybe checking to see how far she'd go for him. What? Why would some guy want to force her to have sex with her husband? That doesn't make any sense. None of this does. Yeah, well, I'm not sure it has to make sense at this point, but at least it gives us somewhere to start looking to see who is pulling the strings and why. Ted turned to the computer and started banging through some keys. Hold on, let me get this one email and read it. In less than a minute, I saw him raise his eyebrows in recognition. Okay, here it is, just listen to this, it's from this mystery dude. He began reading the email in a loud, authoritarian voice, taking on the tone of the message itself. Kathy, you know me well enough that if you don't do what I say, I will end our relationship. If I can't trust you to do something simple, how can I trust you with my love? How can I trust you to carry out our plans so that we can be together? I'm taking a huge risk for us. You need to show me that you have what it takes, and I need to show you what kind of man your husband really is. He looked over to me and raised his eyebrows, gauging my reaction, which was undoubtedly one of confusion and disgust. I nodded my head weakly. Okay. Ted continued. So Kathy answers with an email that she got it done, and that she sees the light and was ready to do whatever she was asked. My head was still spinning in confusion when I mumbled out a question asking if Ted had any idea who was pulling Kathy's strings. He licked his lips and leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in back of his head. Some guy named Danny, he said flatly. You or Kathy know a guy of that name that might have a reason to want Richardson dead? Ted's question struck me like an ice pick to the chest and, suddenly, in my mind's eye, I could see a seemingly distraught, gorgeous blonde woman with perfect skin and a knockout body crying her eyes out as she gave me the directions to her husband's death scene. Yeah, I do. Only, Danny isn't a guy. Combing through the emails felt like sitting in the middle of some kind of intervention in which the uncaring participant's goal was to get you to see that you are a naive a-hole that everyone hates. The plot to knock off Craig Richardson was never directly discussed, but occasionally alluded to and I was discussed in varying, rather derogatory terms, including the oaf, the prick, and the patsy. The last term made it clear to me what my role in the Richardson murder was meant to be, and it occurred to both Ted and me that it was time to contact the police. Should we call? Ted asked. No, I want to get out of here. Let's just go to the station and bring the laptop. I don't want any misunderstandings. Let's take your car. I don't feel like driving right now. I picked up the laptop and started limping toward the door. Ted grabbed his keys, and we left the apartment and rounded a corner on the outside walkway to take the stairs down to the parking lot. As I passed a small alcove opening to some apartment doors, I heard a brief shuffle and then a very distinctive click and turned to find myself looking down the barrel of a gun, held steadily at my head by the shave-headed thug from Green Valley Hill. Don't move, a-hole. Don't move at all. One little twitch from you or your friend, and I'll blow your head off. His voice was thick and deep with a hint of some sort of an East Coast accent. From behind me, I could hear Ted starting to hyperventilate, mumbling out a choked cry. Oh God, oh shit. Shavehead smiled grimly. Now, I want you to slowly bend down and lay the laptop on the ground and slide it to me. There was no advantage in disobeying, so I did as he said, as slowly and carefully as possible. Shavehead made no move to pick it up, but rather pushed it against the wall with the side of his foot. Okay, now, I want your car keys. At this point, I thought I'd play for time and started to shake my head as if to say I didn't have them on me. Shavehead flared his nostrils and spoke to me through gritted teeth in a clear, malevolent voice. Give them to me now, because if you don't, one of two things are going to happen. I'll shoot you for the hell of it right away, or I'll search you, find them, and then shoot you for the hell of it. I nodded, shrugged my shoulders in capitulation, and slowly retrieved the keys from my front pocket to dangle them by 2 fingers in front of Shavehead. He reached forward and I quickly tossed them over his head, distracting him as I threw myself over the railing to the alley below, and felt an electric shock run through my ankle and already injured thigh as I landed. Ignoring the pain, I made my way to the edge of the building, turned the corner and staggered down an alleyway that was partially blocked by a large, jet black limousine, the motor still running and one of the passenger doors open. Leaning against the trunk, still wearing the French braids and clad in the sundress, was the small, seemingly inconsequential figure of Danielle Richardson, holding some sort of a baton in her right hand, her face a mixture of exasperation and surprise. She stood and took a step toward me, raising the baton in front of her, holding it like it was some sort of a sword, but I kept stumbling onward, thinking that even with a hurt ankle and a throbbing thigh, she couldn't offer any real resistance. I was wrong though. As she shoved the baton into my right shoulder, I caught a glimpse of two spikes projecting from the end and then felt an electrical explosion that stopped me in my tracks and then sent me to my knees as she kept it pressed against me. I lost the ability to support myself and fell to the ground, where she continued the shock until I found myself rolling up into the fetal position, unable to move, barely able to breathe. And then she spoke. But the voice I heard had none of the softness of the woman I'd met at the party or the vulnerability of the crying wife I'd encountered the evening before. Her speech was direct and harsh and sent a chill through my very core. "Stay the hell down or I'll shock you until you're a zombie." She called out to the shavehead and he shouted something back that I didn't understand and a few minutes later appeared with Ted, literally in tow, his hands bound together with zip ties, clothesline wrapped multiple times around his torso with one end free to act as a sort of leash. She looked at Shavehead and gestured toward me while keeping the stun baton a few inches from my chest. He nodded and opened up a satchel, pulling out some zip ties and a long length of clothesline and proceeded to bind my wrists and truss me up identically to Ted, all while I tried to suppress my ever-increasing sense of panic. "What now?" The voice came from in back of me, soft and unsure, completely familiar but strangely alien at the same time. I turned awkwardly and saw Kathy standing in the flickering light of a dying street lamp. She was an ill-defined silhouette, and it was hard to see her clearly, but I could make out a stun baton, similar to what Danielle carried, in her left hand and a handgun, probably a 9mm in her right. She assiduously avoided looking at me while she waited for an answer, looking only toward Danielle. Our love had clearly died some time ago, but the idea that she was part of some sort of murderous plot with me as the patsy made my insides turn cold. Quietly, desperately, I called her name and tried to make eye contact, but Shavehead raised the .38 to my face, told me to shut up and then ordered me to stand. Between my sprained ankle, the thigh laceration and my tied hands, I could barely make it to my feet, rising like a drunken bum. Trevor, the Shavehead, turned to Kathy and tossed her the keys, asking if she'd found my car. "Yeah, it's over there," she said, pointing vaguely to the parking lot. The Shavehead grunted. "Okay, let's go," he said, giving Ted and me a shove in the direction of the car. We took a couple of steps before Danielle told him to stop. With some annoyance, she barked out that the original plans were off because we'd seen her, and that we might as well get in the limo for the first half of the ride and have Kathy take my car to the meeting place. Trevor gave her a questioning look, but she took a step toward him and mumbled something under her breath about keeping me separate from Kathy as much as possible. He nodded and then looked to Kathy. "You know the place?" "Yeah, sure." Her voice sounded unsure, disappointed. "Okay, then. Take his car and we'll meet you there." She nodded to him, turned and began walking briskly in the direction of my car, while Trevor herded Ted and me into the back seat of the limo. The limo was spacious, with plush leather bench seats facing each other across a carpeted open area. Faint running lights partially illuminated the inside of the car. Danielle climbed into the seat facing us, holding the stun baton as well as the .38 that Trevor had been carrying. She trained the gun on us both and strongly insisting we sit still and say nothing. Trevor settled into the driver's seat, briefly glanced into the back to make sure everything was okay, and then smoothly guided the car out of the alley and onto the surface streets. We were heading north, probably towards either the mansion or Green Valley Hill. Through the limo's running lights and the street lights that flashed through the windows like a washed-out strobe, I tried to take the measure of the other riders. Trevor seemed nervous, his hands gripping and unripping the wheel as he drove, occasionally let out long, low breaths as if he'd was intermittently holding his breath. Ted looked like a frightened child, nervously glancing around the car, beads of sweat appearing on his face, too scared to make conversation and too anxious to sit still. I had to wonder if I looked more or less the same. Danielle was oozing confidence and seemed almost bored. She continued to eye us with unconcealed contemptuous amusement, lazily point the gun in our general direction, checking her watch every few minutes. The fear and uncertainty were generating a sort of nervous energy that made me feel as if my heart was going to explode, as well as a kind of paralyzing confusion. But my mind was screaming at me to do something, that my life was hanging by a thread, and I was just sitting there watching it tick away. I decided I had nothing to lose, so I started trying a bluff at first, hoping that I could shake Danielle up. I tried to put some confidence in my voice, but I could hear my own tremulousness when I spoke. You know, I've called the police. They know what's up, so there's no way that whatever you're trying to do here is going to work. Her eyes narrowed and she looked at me with angry contempt, and I thought for sure she'd tell me to shut up. But then her expression softened to a sort of smug smile before she let out a condescending laugh. I rather doubt that, Tom. It's become rather evident over the last few months that you aren't particularly bright. So let me point out some things that should have been obvious to you by now. Your phone has been cloned and we've got a tracer on your car. So we know you haven't called anyone at all, and we know exactly where you've been all night. I suppose you could have used Ted's phone, but I rather doubt that, or you wouldn't be turning. What is the phrase from that song? A whiter shade of pale? She stretched lazily and actually let out an exaggerated yawn, feigning boredom. In any case, we have little choice but to act as though the police don't know anything. We certainly can't just let you go now, can we? You could run and leave all that money my poor dead husband would leave to me? I don't think so, Tom. No, I'm afraid there's no way around the fact that the police are going to find a grisly murder and you will be the one to blame. But it will be tough for you to defend yourself because you'll be dead too. The jealous husband, finding his wife with the rich, philandering businessman, shoots the lover and then turns the gun on himself. She shook her head in mock dismay. So, very tragic. But it's a common story, really. I'm sure my face gave away my puzzlement as I tried to digest what she just said. I began to babble. Yeah, well, I think your story is full of holes. I don't own a gun, so the police will wonder about that. And what the hell kind of a guy invites his friend over for a murder-suicide? Or shoots the lover but doesn't plug the wife? Huh, nobody will buy this at all. She groaned in mock exasperation, cutting my diatribe off. Oh God, you are really dumb, aren't you? I probably shouldn't really tell you this, but what the hell, Tom, what the hell? She leaned forward as if to tell a secret, smiling smugly. First off, I think it's a pretty good story. Especially since you'll be using the gun you bought at a gun show a couple of days after half of the charity staff saw your wife essentially dry hump my husband out of the party and then watched you drag her out by the arm, practically kicking and screaming. I didn't buy a gun. She laughed again. Well, that's not what your credit card statement shows, or the records at the gun show for that matter. They'll both say that you bought a .38. She tapped the gun with her stun baton. This .38, in fact. She paused as she let that sink in and then started again, gesturing toward Ted with the baton. Now, we didn't plan on your friend here coming along, so he's going to run into some problems in some other part of town. Probably something like a heroin overdose. I suspect nobody will even know he's missing for a few days. There may be an odd piece of evidence here or there, but I'm quite confident that the police will put the scene together the way I've constructed it and make all the loose ends tie themselves up. I swallowed hard, trying to think of some hole in her story. Come on, that won't fly. Do you really think they aren't going to notice your husband was dead for 5 or 6 hours longer than me? Ah, those timelines get fuzzy if the bodies aren't discovered right away. After a few days? After a few days? Kathy's going to tell them she hung out for a few days before calling them? You haven't thought this through. The police aren't that stupid. Danielle studied me with a blank, incredulous look, shaking her head in gentle disbelief, as though I was some sort of remedial student that was simply not grasping the obvious. Nothing was said for a moment or two when, out of nowhere, Ted interrupted, his voice tired and strained. Tom, they're going to kill her too. They're going to find 3 bodies there, all dead by the same gun. The truth of what he said was immediately obvious to me, and I found myself looking at Danielle with even more disgust, blurting out the first thing that crossed my mind. My God, you're a monster. Evidently resolved to drop any pretense about what was actually planned. Danielle cocked her head, looked me right in the eye and smirked. So, why do you care? She shouldn't mean shit to you at this point, and frankly, she doesn't mean shit to me. She's just a tool to me, like everyone else I meet. A tool to use and then discard when it ceases to be useful. I'm pretty sure I'd come across sociopaths at school and at work, but I'd never had one so blatantly express their contempt and general misanthropy in such explicit terms. I opened my mouth to respond, but realized there was nothing I could say that would shake Danielle up about the planned murders, so I turned to the shavehead instead. So, Trevor, If Danny here uses everyone as a tool to get what she wants, how you fit in? He looked briefly into the rear-view mirror and with the force and abruptness of a dog's bark responded, "Shut the hell up." Danielle laughed and leaned forward. "Trevor and I go way back. We've been together since I was 14, and he's the one person that means anything to me. Without him, I wouldn't have survived the boredom and banality of high school with all the disgusting little pimply boys and vacuous girls. He's the one man, the one person that I need. So, you can talk all you want, but really your transparent attempts to create some sort of tension between us are just pathetic. You have to remember your place. You're just another tool and have been for months." She still sounded confident, but I caught just a whiff of vulnerability, of worry, when I challenged Trevor about her trustworthiness, so I decided to push some more. "How the hell can Trevor trust you? You probably say the same crap about anybody you need when they're around. I'm sure Kathy thinks you and she are true lovers or something." Trevor glanced in the mirror again and said something under his breath, but Danielle reached back and patted his shoulder without taking her eyes off me. "You know, Tom, you're an annoying, stupid little prick. I'm carrying a gun here, and you are trying to be provocative. Well, so what? I'm dead before the night's over anyway, right? What the hell difference does it make to me if I die here now, or in a couple of hours? I'll guess it matters to you some though, since I doubt very much you'd want to plug me right here." I started to lean toward her, moving my bound hands toward her slowly but with purpose. In fact, what exactly is going to keep me from trying to take away? Keeping the gun pointed directly at me, Danielle quickly reached for something at her feet and produced a long black stick. "Move 1 inch closer and I'll have to tase you," she said matter-of-factly, and then casually reached over to Ted and touched the stick to his exposed, sockless shin just above the shoe. Ted's response reminded me of a drawing-eyed scene of a soldier who was dying of tetanus, his fists clenched, his back arched severely upward and his teeth clamped into a painful-appearing rictus. A moment after pulling back the taser, Ted collapsed back onto the bench seat, unconscious but breathing raggedly. "Would you like another taste?" I was speechless for a moment, watching my friend convulse, but tried to avoid looking too rattled. "Why tase him? You just like me better, or something?" "No, but I don't want to have to clean you up if you shit your pants. It would make the crime scene a little harder to explain." "You think you've thought of everything." "I have." I raised my eyebrows at her arrogance. "You know you'll miss something. This will stink like yesterday's garbage, and the police will be all over this with a fine-tooth comb. I'm guessing your bald boyfriend there probably has some sort of a record, even if you don't, and that combined with the amount of money involved here is going to get their investigative juices flowing." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt cloud Danielle's face, but this was quickly replaced by anger, and she leaned forward with the baton extended and I braced for a shock. But then she backed off and laughed. "Don't try and think so much, Tom. You aren't good at it. Neither of us have records that are discoverable. And besides, why be suspicious of me or Trev when the killer is obvious? It will all seem very, very typical to the police. I'm quite sure of that. You think you can pull off the grieving widow act?" "I can pull anything off. As you know, I'm quite the actress and I'm quite convincing. People do what I want because I am what they want." I snorted with as much contempt as I could muster. God, what an ego. "It's not bragging if it's true, Tom." She spit out my name like it was a bug that had somehow found its way into her mouth. "Take your darling little wife, for example. She went from the devoted, loving spouse to my little plaything within a matter of weeks, and from there it was a hop, skip, and a jump to becoming my accomplice in a plan to have my husband eliminated. A plan that included having you take the fall. Oh, she had some guilty moments from time to time and even mentioned backing out once, but I gave her an ultimatum and she came back to me, begging for another chance, swearing she'd do anything to get back into my bed." Danielle leaned forward, her eyes locking into mine, demanding my full attention, a malevolent grin oozing from her lips. "And you know what I did then, Tom? I made her prove her love to me by doing something completely odious, something that, to her, was so disgusting that it took an act of supreme will and love for me to make her way through it." I looked back at her with a blank face, trying to process what she was telling me. "Why, don't you know, Tom? I made her have sex with you, and I made her force you to have sex. Humiliating, isn't it? To know that sex with you was a sort of punishment? Some horrible ordeal to have to go through to prove her love to me." She paused to smirk, letting out an arrogant little laugh. "And then do you know what I did? I convinced her it was an assault. I twisted her little mind to see that since she didn't want it, and because she hated it, that you must have forced it on her, even though it was her idea, really my idea, in the first place. So, by the time I was done with her, she was not only completely in love with me, but she hated you. She hated you enough to sell you down the proverbial river, just like a good little tool. I grit my teeth and waited for a tidal wave of humiliated anger to wash over me before responding, again, as cool and calm as I could in order to limit her satisfaction to the absolute minimum. You don't control nearly as much as you think you do. You certainly can't control me. Oh, you are so wrong. I could have done things directly, seduced you, turned you into my little plaything, and made you kill Craig yourself, just to be with me. But that would have been a little messy. It's hard to keep men from bragging to their friends, and I might have had some difficulty if it became known that I'd let you screw me. You're insane if you think you could get me too. What, you don't think I'd be able to turn you into a little puppet after we had sex? You're not giving your libido enough credit, and you're giving your sense of dignity way too much? No, I don't even think you'd have gotten me in bed. She laughed. Oh, come now. With the looks you gave me at the party? Or even earlier today when I was the femme fatale? You were dying to put an arm around me for comfort, and from there it's a breeze for a woman like me to get a man in bed. What the hell makes you think you'd be able to hold out? I let her question sit in the air for a minute and then answered, as casually as my rapidly beating heart allowed. I have a rule that I follow pretty strictly when it comes to sex. A rule? Don't make me laugh. Rules of fidelity are like tiny speed bumps for me. Oh, it's not about fidelity. I paused for effect, and she looked at me with an element of curiosity, waiting for me to finish. It's just that I only have sex with human beings, and you don't really qualify. Her eyes popped open in sudden, unpleasant surprise and then quickly narrowed to thin, angry, snake-like slits as she reflexively reached for the taser and brought it towards me again. Trying to keep any advantage, I simply laughed. What? Is the queen losing her control? Her facial features had hardened into a permanent mask of anger and disgust, and she began to spit out words as if they were made of acid. I'm losing control, says the chump with the gun pointed at him. Remember, Tom, I've manipulated you from day one. It took a little longer than I wanted, because you were considerably more stupid than I thought. I mean, honestly, how could you not think your wife was screwing Craig after that party? Any real man would have started investigating then. But no, not you. You had to keep trying to… What exactly? Save your marriage? She laughed again, a bitter, mocking sound that hit me like fingernails on a chalkboard. So we had to go farther. We had to literally make you read about it on her computer in order to get you to figure things out. But once you caught on, you were as predictable as we thought, taking the bait and charging out like an enraged bull. In the end, you made it so very easy. I did my best to keep a semblance of a smirk while she delivered her diatribe. I may have taken the bait, but I can't imagine this. I gestured to the car and Ted. This is how it was supposed to go. Dragging us at gunpoint back to the scene of the crime after Mr. Clean here lets me escape through window? This was your plan? Plans change, but the result will be the same. She turned her head away from me, and it was clear that our exchange was over. A few minutes later, we pulled off on a side road for half a mile, eventually stopping amongst some dumpsters and scattered trash in an alleyway between a couple of stores at a worn-out strip mall. We sat for a minute, evidently waiting for Kathy, Ted and I anxiously looking around while Danielle kept her gun on us, quietly whispering a couple of things to Shavehead. Finally, Kathy arrived in my car, parked in back of the limo and jumped out awkwardly, nearly falling down as rushed toward us. Trevor the Shavehead waited until she got to the limo and then climbed out of the driver's seat, opened the rear door to help Danielle out, taking the gun from her and keeping his eye on us the whole time. Shavehead started herding us toward our car as Kathy stood next to Danielle, nervously rocking back and forth from one foot to the next to Danielle, mostly looking at her, but occasionally glancing over to Ted and me. I didn't know Kathy anymore, didn't know her mind or understand her at all really, but it seemed pretty clear that she had very little understanding of Danielle, her plans, or the eventual endgame, and I had to believe that if I could get her to see the truth, the plan might start to unravel. I tried to catch her eye, but it was too dark, so I called out to her, yelling out that she was making a mistake, that she was being duped. Trevor immediately brought a taser to my neck and hissed an insistent warning that I stop making any noise at all. He shoveled Ted into the front passenger seat of my car and pushed me into the back seat, forcing me to slide over to the driver's side. He climbed in afterwards and started talking in a low, threatening voice, the gun trained on me, the taser at the back of Ted's neck. Okay, boys, this is the way it's going to be for the ride to Green Valley Hill. Any sound out of either of you, and I mean any sound, and Ted here gets a shock. A second sound, a second shock at a higher setting. If either of you push me, I'll shock him to death. Okay, got it. We nodded mutely in response. Danielle led Kathy by the hand to my side of the car and knocked on my window, forcing Shavehead to lean across me and roll it down. She whispered something about keeping me in line and then pulled away, motioning him to keep the window open as she smirked at me. Danielle turned to Kathy and put her hands gently on her shoulders, commanding my wife's undivided, worshipful attention. She began speaking in a soft, soothing, sexy voice, just loud enough for me to make out that she was telling her how much she loved her, wanted her, was looking forward to being with her, and that their time was almost there. She added that I was still the only thing that could get in her way, and that Kathy shouldn't listen to anything her bitter, jealous husband had to say. All through this rather sickening, one-sided conversation of unadulterated lies, Kathy signaled her agreement by nodding her head, almost like a child anxious to please a doting parent. Danielle then gently put both hands on Kathy's face and slowly moved in to kiss her, Kathy accepting her lips with her eyes closed. Kathy was noticeably trembling and her knees buckled slightly, giving her the appearance of being considerably shorter than Danielle, even though they were roughly the same height. The kiss became increasingly passionate. When the kiss finally broke, Kathy was left panting as though she'd just run a desperate race, while Danielle turned to smirk at me once again, making it clear that the kiss was mostly a performance meant to further rub my nose in the fact of the total sexual capitulation of my wife to her. Kathy kept staring lovingly, expectantly at Danielle, and I could only turn my head in impotent anger and frustration. A few minutes later, we were riding silently toward Green Valley Hill, Kathy driving, Trevor still pointing a gun at me and holding a taser to the back of Ted's neck. Other than the occasional, muted sound of a passing car, we rode in utter silence, barely daring to breathe loudly, let alone speak. I figured the drive to Green Valley Hill would be around an hour, and there had been occasions when that seemed like a long time to me. But with the bleak reality that my life would likely be snuffed out at the end of the hour, I could feel the minutes ticking by like seconds, like I'd been pushed off a cliff and I could see the ground rushing up to me. I knew I should have been thinking about a plan, any plan, to try and get out of this mess alive, but my mind kept racing from topic to topic as the panic born of a fear of dying began to set in. I thought of my parents and how they'd handle the news that I'd been killed in some sort of jealous rage, how my mom would likely blame my dad because he'd been the one to encourage me to be aggressive and confrontational. I thought of my friends and how I'd let work, married life, and social laziness get in the way of enjoying their company. I thought of my work and my hobbies, sports and music, and how I really enjoyed so many things in life. And I thought of Kathy and shook my head in continued disbelief at what the woman I loved had become. A couple of miles away from Green Valley Hill, it came to me that since continuing to go along with Danielle's plan would mean death, that doing anything at all was better than voluntarily lying down in my grave. As we pulled up the drive, I still had no other plan than to try and get through to Kathy somehow, even if it meant risking a shock from Trevor. Kathy pulled my car off the driveway and parked it in a semi-concealed area behind some bushes that were immediately adjacent to the woods I'd navigated the night before. Trevor jumped out of the car and began barking out orders like a cantankerous guard dog, pulling open the doors and hustling Ted and me out. He tied a length of rope around my bound wrists and handed the other end to Kathy, who slipped the loop around her left hand that now also held a baton. Swearing softly, he went back to the car and rummaged through the back seat for a moment until he produced another similar rope. He approached Ted and ordered him to put his hands up so that he could rope him off also, but Ted simply remained standing without moving, looked over to me, and then back to Trevor, and then, without any warning whatsoever, bolted for the woods. Trevor swore loudly and exploded after him, his feet pounding away at a gravel walkway while he yelled for Kathy to take me to the cabin. She immediately yanked on the rope around my wrists and began walking briskly up the driveway, effectively pulling me like a reluctant dog on a leash. She wasn't taking chances, sidestepping her way up the driveway with her head cranked over her shoulder so that she could watch me the whole time. The gun in her free hand pointed squarely at the center of my chest. Between the gun and the taser and my bound wrists, overpowering Kathy seemed out of the question. But at least we were alone now, and I had my first, and probably only chance to chip away at her resolve and penetrate the delusional fantasy world that Danielle had constructed of lies, lust, and false love. And so, I began to talk, slowly at first, carefully probing with ideas or comments, observing her reaction, trying to find something effective, and then, more quickly and with more desperation as the time I had to turn her mind around began slipping away. I told her that the plan would never work, that she'd end up in jail, that if she stopped now and ran, she might have a chance of freedom with Danielle. I told her she wasn't thinking clearly and that she'd eventually wake up and hate herself for what she was doing, that she could never be happy in a relationship built off murder and betrayal. By the time we'd reached the house and stood in the great room, waiting for Trevor to return with Ted, she hadn't answered or blinked or even said anything beyond 1 or 2 word orders, acting like an emotionless automaton. But when I began describing Danielle as a con artist that couldn't be trusted, the icy cold facade that had become Kathy's face broke and I saw a flicker of anger and doubt. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again, retraining the pistol at my chest, her eyes narrowing, her jaw clenched. It was the first reaction of any kind that I'd gotten, so I pressed my argument forward as quickly and loudly as I could. She's a user, Kathy. She's using you. She doesn't love you. She never has. She's turned you against me so that I could be a patsy in her scheme too. Abruptly, and without warning, Kathy screamed her response, thrusting the pistol toward my chest. Shut up, Tom. Shut the hell up. This is all for me and for her. She loves me more than you ever could. She loves me. Her voice was becoming strained with an intense shrillness that somehow gave away a sense of doubt about what she'd been saying. We began shouting over each other. She doesn't love you. She's using you. I loved you. You didn't love me. You assaulted me. You assaulted me, and she is saving me from you. I never assaulted you. You asked me. I asked you. I didn't force anything on you. You humiliated me, just like she said you would. And now you're trying to weasel away the truth because you're scared. Suddenly, we stopped yelling, eyeing each other, our breaths coming in deep, nervous spasms. I was frantically searching my mind for any argument that could make Kathy see the truth, see that I hadn't betrayed her, but that Danielle would, and that she'd suffer the same fate as Craig Richardson and me. My mind skipped across all the possible things I could say that might possibly break through Kathy's psychological barriers and let her see the light. But I could think of nothing, not my protestations of love, not the contents of my conversations with Danielle, not even an appeal to common sense was going to make any impact at all. I knew that Kathy would have to see for herself where, exactly, she stood with Danielle and Trevor, and it occurred to me that would eventually come just moments before the end. If nothing else, I could at least make her alert to that eventuality. I slowed my breathing and tried to lock into Kathy's eyes, tried to get her full, undivided attention. Listen to me, Kathy. Listen to me. You and Danielle were setting me up as Richardson's killer, but she was also setting me up as your killer. The police aren't going to find 2 bodies. They're going to find 3. They'll find me and Richardson all right, the husband and the lover. But they'll also find... Shut up, Tom. Don't you say another thing? Think, Kathy. Think. Why do you have to be in the room at all, but not Danielle? Don't you think Trevor could handle this on his own? If Danielle really cared about your safety, wouldn't she keep you out of the way? There's really only one good reason that you had to be there, and it wasn't to help Trevor. Kathy was shaking her head angrily, but I could see an element of anxiety appear in her face. I could see the doubt grow. They were going to find you on the bed with your lover, and me at the foot, and we'd all be dead. All the witnesses dead. Suddenly, Kathy screamed and fired the gun into the ceiling, stopping my diatribe short as my mouth turned to cotton and my heart rolled over in my chest. If you say another word, one more word, I swear to God I'll shoot you right here and now. As she re-aimed the gun to my chest, I raised my shaking hands in a gesture of uneasy truce, slowly nodding my head in agreement, hoping that she would calm down and maybe think about what I'd said. We stood there for a lifetime. Or for a few minutes if you believe the clock on the wall, like 2 angry statues facing each other in a confrontation empty of sound except for our ragged breathing and the blood rushing through my ears. The silent standoff came to an abrupt end when the front door banged open and Trevor pounded into the room swearing fluently about the problems that Ted's presence had caused. He stopped in the great room, legs spread slightly, his gun in his right hand, his hand rubbing his bald scalp, taking in the scene for a moment before looking pointedly at Kathy. Did I hear a gunshot? Kathy took in a breath and answered in a reluctant stammer. I had to fire a warning shot into the ceiling. Well, shit, Trevor stated flatly, looking up at the ceiling 30 feet above his head. It doesn't look like it did any damage, so I doubt anyone is going to notice. He jerked his head toward the upstairs bedroom. Take him up to the bedroom. I'll meet you there in a second. Kathy nodded obediently and gave a savage tug to the rope before starting toward the stairs. The march toward the bedroom brought us close together and I, one last time, attempted to foster some doubt in Kathy, whispering hoarsely as we climbed the treads. Kathy, listen to me. When he gets into the bedroom, he's positioned you in some way to set up the crime scene. Maybe get you on the bed somehow so he can shoot you next to Richardson. But first, he's going to tell you to get rid of your gun. Whatever you do, don't put your gun down. Just don't put it down." She turned and looked at me, her face a contorted mask of hate and disdain, briefly waving the gun in front of my face as a warning gesture. She didn't say anything. Her expression was sufficient, and I stopped talking. I felt a sickening sense of déjà vu as I entered the bedroom again. Craig Richardson's body was still there, perhaps a little grayer than it had been a few hours before, but otherwise unchanged, semi-recumbent against the pillows set against the headboard. The broken window to the right of the bed hadn't been altered either, but the speakers that had played the sounds of my wife's fictitious tryst had been removed. Kathy motioned toward a chair at the side of the bed, barked out an order for me to sit as she looped her end of the restraining rope around one of the bedposts. And again, we waited, the tension building up in me so tight that I thought either my head or my chest would explode at any time. The feeling worsening considerably when I heard Trevor's footsteps coming up the stairway. Just as he had a few hours before, Trevor the shavehead burst into the bedroom and took a quick inventory, checking the bed and my position for a moment. But while Trevor checked out me, I also checked out him out and could see by the way he was assessing the room as well as the people, dead and living, that he was, indeed, trying to sort out how he was going to choreograph the upcoming assassinations. Keeping my teeth locked shut, I let out a hoarse whisper, just loud enough for Kathy to hear. "Remember what I told you, Kathy. Don't put down your gun." Kathy was watching Trevor closely now, her expression having changed from angry defiance to anxious concern. After a minute, Trevor rubbed his head again and motioned to Kathy with the gun in his hand. "Okay, I think we should do it this way. You get on the bed next to Craig. We'll arrange it so I'll hold the gun to his head, and when I plug him some of the blood will get on you. It will seem more realistic that way." Kathy suddenly took in a sharp breath but otherwise didn't respond, standing motionless, staring at Trevor, her brow wrinkling, biting her lip, thinking. Trevor looked back at her and brusquely reiterated his orders. "Come on, Kathy, get moving, and put the damn gun down first." But Kathy just stood there, her whole body wavering slightly like a tree in a strong breeze, seemingly unable to move her feet at all, a little tremor beginning around her lips and chin. Trevor barked his demands one more time, but when she still didn't move, he looked at her more closely, took in her doubtful expression, the slow, disbelieving shake of her head, the utter and sudden lack of cooperation, and his attitude changed, a hint of panic and fear now clouding his face. Without warning, he raised the gun in his right hand and fired at Kathy. It was in that moment that I came to realize two important things. The first was that it wasn't some feat of athleticism or just plain crazy luck that allowed me to escape the tendrils of the stun gun that Trevor had fired at me the night before, because, despite Kathy standing still not more than 15 feet from him, the bullet sailed just over her right shoulder and struck the wall behind her. The truth was that Trevor was just a bad shot. The second realization was that Kathy was not. She quickly raised her gun and fired twice, striking the shavehead dead center in the chest and knocking him off his feet, sending him to the floor with a loud thud. She stared at him for a moment, her head still shaking in disbelief, her mouth opening and closing, silently forming words with no meaning, and then she dropped the gun to the floor and followed it herself, collapsing into a heap. "Oh God," she cried simply. "Oh God." My memories of the rest of that day are compressed together so that it feels like it all occurred at the same time, like kaleidoscopically juxtaposed scenes in a waking nightmare. At some point, Ted appeared at the door, hands still bound, the restraining rope dragging some sort of a bracket that he'd been tied to that he had evidently been able to detach. He entered the room cautiously with a look of fear that melted into relief when he saw who was dead and who was alive, sat down on the floor and gave me a look that said, "You've really gotten us into some crazy shit." At some point before the police arrived, Ted and I had managed to completely free ourselves from the ropes and zip ties and were seated quietly in the great room downstairs. One officer stayed with us and took our statements while half a dozen others went upstairs to the murder room to investigate and question Kathy. I was later told that when they arrived in the room, she still hadn't moved, lying in a heap on the floor, crying and muttering softly to herself. I remember being loaded into a police cruiser, taken to a hospital where Ted and I were checked out then released. I have a vague recollection of taking a taxi return home, followed by an utterly sleepless night in what had been my marital bed. The trial was, of course, a headline-grabbing circus of sensationalistic half-truths and indecent conjecture. The combination of murder, money, and sex was far too much for the press to leave alone, and so virtually everyone who was even remotely associated with the story was the target of interviews and speculation. Initially cast as a cold, semi-abusive husband, the press eventually changed their tune when some of the facts started leaking out and simply portrayed me as a feckless man who didn't have a clue about his half-crazy wife. It was a characterization that I couldn't really disagree with. The court elected to try the women separately when it became clear that Kathy's defense would be to paint Danielle as the mastermind, essentially portraying Kathy as an enthralled, mentally compromised pawn that had lost the capacity to refuse her lover's demands. I had my doubts about the veracity of this defense because that's not the way I'd really seen Kathy during our marriage, but as the trial wore on, I became aware of just how little I knew or understood about my wife and eventually realized that at least some of what her lawyers were selling was rooted in the truth. Nothing in the case the prosecution built was a surprise to me. They presented facts and witness showing that Danielle, Kathy, and Trevor had conspired to murder Craig Richardson and frame me, a dead me, for the crime. Even most of the defense witnesses told the same story, although most of them, me included, testified that Danielle was the driving force and her scheme not only planned for the death of Richardson, but for Kathy also, that Trevor had likely pulled the trigger on Richardson and that Kathy shot him in self-defense. But the testimony of the last 3 defense witnesses took me by surprise. The first was Kathy's mom. She was always a frail-looking woman, but at the trial she looked worse than I'd ever seen her, taking the stand nervously, somewhat reluctantly, almost as if the very act of testifying was physically painful. She was so emotional that it was difficult to follow her testimony, stuttering out answers in a voice so quiet and tremulous that the defense frequently had to ask her to repeat herself. Now, I'd assumed she'd been called as a character witness of sorts, to give testimony about how Kathy was essentially a good person that had gotten caught up in a bad situation. But it turned out that her testimony was the first real key in portraying Kathy as an emotionally unstable victim rather than a co-conspirator. She answered questions at length about Kathy's childhood, alluding to some things I had a vague knowledge about, including some early issues with depression, cutting, and struggles with authority. But then she described an incident that stunned me, an episode in Kathy's life that I'd never heard about, something that any husband ought to have known. She explained that when Kathy was in high school, she'd had an affair, or rather, had been the victim of sexually exploitive behavior by a powerful adult figure. The predator was her English teacher, a 35-year-old woman that Kathy worshipped and fell deeply in love with. The affair had gone on for at least a year and Kathy had essentially become the woman's puppet, living life completely under her direction. But the evidence for the sexual involvement wasn't rock solid and Kathy refused to testify against her lover, who ended up losing her job but doing no jail time. Kathy didn't fare so well and plunged into a deep depression, making an attempt on her life with an overdose. She was hospitalized and then went on for several years of therapy, but she stabilized in college and got even better after she met me, after which she stopped seeing counselors. At the end of her testimony, Kathy's mom tearfully related how she had hoped that the episode had been buried solidly in the past once she got engaged, and admitted that she and Kathy had gone to great pains to keep me relatively uninformed about her previous issues. The next witness was the defense's psychiatrist, a prim and proper woman that looked like a librarian, complete with horned-rimmed glasses and hair in a tight bun. She gave her testimony sitting bolt upright, hands folded in her lap, answering even the most salacious questions with a businesslike, monotonal voice that made her sound somewhat disinterested in the trial as a whole. She detailed Kathy's involvement with Danielle, describing how they'd met on the job and that Danielle, a woman who was a master manipulator, immediately recognized Kathy as someone she could dominate. She described how they became friends at first and how Danielle created a need in Kathy to please her, first with the quality of her work, then with her company, and finally with sexual favors. She began to eat what Danielle suggested, dress the way she wanted, and act the way she insisted. It wasn't long before Kathy would do very nearly anything that Danielle requested. In essence, according to the psychologist, Kathy was recapitulating the experience she had with her high school teacher, only with a much stronger, more dominant woman. The psychiatrist went on to explain that the one thing Kathy resisted was playing a part in the ultimate betrayal by participating in her scheme to have me killed and framed. But by manipulating Kathy into accepting that the 4th of July's sex was actually assault, she was able to convince her that I wasn't worth protecting, and she finally fell in line. Finally, she gave her professional opinion that Kathy was laboring under a delusion that made it impossible to challenge Danielle's declaration of right and wrong, let alone tell her no. The final witness was Kathy herself, looking wan, exhausted, and maybe somewhat sleepless. Like her mother, she could barely hold it together on the stand, often pausing to compose herself for several minutes at a time. She reiterated the same story and line of thinking that her mother and her psychiatrist had offered and generally cut a sympathetic figure when questioned by the defense. But the main prosecuting attorney, a grim-faced man with a sharp, piercing voice, wasn't letting her off the hook and hammered her when she tried to play the abused wife, especially when she alluded to her conviction that she'd been assaulted. Ms. Foster, are you telling me that the encounter you had with your husband on the night of 4th of July was a traumatically unwelcome sexual advance that made you afraid of him? Kathy looked down and in a near whisper answered, Yes. Yes, it was unwelcome, and it. The prosecutor interrupted as she hesitated. You know, Miss Foster, we've submitted the transcript of that encounter, which you had recorded, as evidence, and we'd be happy to play it for the jury to challenge your testimony here. Now, let me ask you again a little more bluntly, and with the reminder that we can play the recording. Did your husband assault you? Kathy looked up, tears starting to form in her eyes, shaking her head. No. Did he emotionally abuse you? No. Did he, in fact, do anything at all to deserve to be injured by you or your accomplice, let alone be essentially executed? Kathy was openly crying now, shaking her head violently, as if to protect herself from the accusing words that the prosecutor was hurling at her. But he wouldn't let up, redoubling his verbal assault. And yet, Miss Foster, you would have us believe that at the time you were willing to participate in a scheme to have your husband murdered because, in your mind, he somehow deserved it? That he had it coming? In light of the evidence, the transcript and the video recording and the witnesses who have all testified that your husband was nothing other than a loving, dutiful spouse, tell us please, Miss Foster, why on earth should we believe for a second that you are anything other than a cold-blooded killer? Why should we believe that your state of mind was such that you honestly thought it was okay to have your husband killed? Now Kathy's whole body was shaking and she was hyperventilating, looking wildly back and forth between the judge and the jury and the prosecutor, who was beginning his question again. Tell us, Ms. Foster, tell us why we should think that you believed. And then suddenly, Kathy half rose out of her seat and in a shrill, strong voice, a near scream, answered, Because when your heart wants something to be true, even if it's something horrible, even if it makes no sense at all, your mind will believe it. Your mind has to believe it, because it's nothing at all without the heart. The courtroom became suddenly silent, and the prosecutor, who for the first time in the trial was taken aback, waited for a few moments before asking his last set of questions. It wasn't long after that the prosecution rested. The jury came back within a few hours, finding Kathy guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and kidnapping in the second degree, the judge sentencing her to 10 years in prison, well under half the time Danielle eventually got. I remember watching the bailiff leading her out of the court, shuffling with her head down, her shoulders lurching from poorly controlled sobs. I watched her carefully, looking for my wife, looking for the woman I loved, but I couldn't find her. The truth was, if I'd been paying attention, I wouldn't have been able to find her for quite some time. She was the one being led off into prison, but somehow, I felt like I'd received a sentence too. I'd loved her fiercely and had given her and our marriage my best, but it wasn't enough. I wasn't enough. My mind could rationalize that it wasn't my fault, but that's not the way I felt and, as Kathy had said in her outburst, the heart calls the shots. I was standing in the courtroom, looking blankly at the wall, considering my unfortunate past and my uncertain future when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to see Ted giving me a somewhat tentative grin. Hey Tom, nightmare's over, right? The bad guys are in jail and the good guys are alive. I sniffed dismissively and shrugged my shoulders. Yeah, I guess. I don't mean to be maudlin, but somehow I feel like I've gotten a prison sentence too. I see a lot of lonely times coming down the pike, starting with tonight. Ted began shaking his head in emphatic disagreement. No, Tom. No lonely nights for you. From here we are going to the nearest bar to start the therapy Dr. Ted has prescribed for you. What? Get drunk every night? I don't think that's going to work, bud. Ted cocked his head and broadened his smile. Nah, that's not what I have planned. A bunch of booze won't help. I know you well enough to understand that. What you need is a girl that you can rescue, a damsel in distress. Someone pretty, but one who's not Looney Tunes. And I'm going to help you find it. He clapped me on the shoulders, raised his eyebrows ridiculously, and nodded his head looking for agreement. I couldn't help but chuckle, my first genuine laugh in months, realizing he was almost certainly right. The only way to quiet the memories of my turbulent past with Kathy was to create new ones with a new woman. My head knew it, but more importantly, my heart felt it. I nodded to Ted, slapped him on the shoulder, and followed him out the courtroom door. It was a few months later that my divorce was finalized. The best part was that I had nothing to lose. The judge already knew of the situation and had no sympathy for Kathy. There was no alimony, no split of assets, and I was free. I did meet her after the divorce. Yes, I want to meet her in prison. I waited for her, and after 10 minutes of waiting, she was there, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and looking much older. "How are you, Kathy?" I asked. She smiled and just nodded her head. "I just came to say goodbye." She was still silent on that. I felt a bit awkward and stood up to leave. "I'm sorry, Tom. I did not know it would hurt you," she said in a low voice. "It does not matter anymore, Kathy. What is done is done. I just came to say goodbye. I hope when you are released, you will be able to find a better life. Just don't try to kill anyone." She nodded. Kathy's stay in prison was going to be a long one. A few months later, I came to know that Danielle was also serving her time in the same prison. Kathy somehow managed to get close to her and stabbed her multiple times. The prison guards found Kathy sitting near her body and smiling. Kathy was later moved from the prison to a mental asylum. I was called by the doctor to help with her recovery since the last time her mental status improved. They assumed that it was because of me. I refused. It was too much to ask from me. It has been 3 years, and now I have a family. I am married to a beautiful woman without any mental issues, and I have a lovely 1-year-old boy and 2 lovely German shepherds. As they say it, life is good. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.